In late October of 1886, the cold didn't bother knocking on Deland Delrore's door. Instead of striking the cabin heating, the northwest wind slipped quietly into a fatal weakness. A 10 inches gap directly beneath the floorboards, funneling through a cut in the ridge, the wind called around the uneven stone piers and mercilessly sucked the heat down through every plank. In the darkness, 6-year-old Milo's rattling cough broke the silence. His older brother, Corbin, strained to drag their bed closer to the stove. It did little good. The blanket touched the floor, and stiffened with cold. A thin skin of ice was already forming across their tin cup. They woke with a start, sat one barefoot down, and pulled it back. She knelt beside her sons and pressed her palm against the boards. Near the stove, they were cold. Beneath the boys, they were colder still. Milo stopped coughing. They leaned close to feel his breath. Then the coughing returned. They looked at the fire. The flames had not failed. Something else inside the cabin had. Delroy was 34 years old. She had buried her husband the previous spring. Everett Rohr, a local wheelwright and wagon repairman, had spent years building wagon wheels, mending freight wagons, and shaping heavy timbers around Rapine Hollow. A pine trunk snapped while he was skidding logs down a frozen slope. The mountain finished the job before anyone reached him. He left behind a weathered cabin, an incomplete set of tools, a page of unpaid credit at Bram Tallins's general store, and a woodpile Dell already knew would not survive a hard winter if the stove had to burn hot every night. Corbin had quietly taken over the chores that once belonged to his father. A split kindling before sunrise. A checked the chicken coop. A hauled water from Crowless Creek. A kept Milo away from the stove whenever Dell worked. A no longer asked whenever it was coming home. Yet each time he used his father's old measuring line, he rolled it into a neat coil before hanging it on the same nail Everett had driven years earlier. Milo still carried the little wooden whistle Everett had carved for him. Since the funeral, he had never blown it. Outside, the grey lodgepole cabin looked ordinary. Inside, Dell counted every stick of firewood as if each one already belonged to January. Dell watched Corbin hang the measuring line back on its nail. She noticed the careful knot. She said nothing, but deep down, she knew she had to find a way to hold onto this fragile warmth before the woodpile ran out. At first, however, Dell didn't even consider that the answer might be hidden in the freezing space beneath the cabin. Like everyone else in Rapine Hollow, she put her faith in the winterizing methods people had always used. She packed bunchgrass and dry straw beneath the floor. 3 days later, melting snow seeped from the roof edge and soaked everything. Wet straw carried cold almost as well as bare air. She stretched grease-soaked canvas along the northwest side of the foundation. The next windstorm snapped the rawhide ties one after another. Al night the loose canvas slapped against the stone piers. Dale and Corbin shoveled earth around the supports and willow branches through the mound. The first deep freeze shrank the saw. Fresh cracks appeared where the wind had never reached before. She hammered narrow strips of cowhide into the floor gaps. She spread an old wool blanket beneath the boy's bed. She moved both beds closer to the stove. Milo coughed less for a few hours, but the cabin filled with smoke because the fire had to burn harder than before. Finally, Dell fed even more wood into the stove. The next morning, Corbin opened a small notebook and marked the number of sticks they had burned, nearly half again, as many as an ordinary day. He hesitated before writing the total. Dell quietly took the charcoal from his hand and finished the mark herself. Neither of them needed to say what the numbers already proved. At that pace, the woodpile would never last until February. Morning brought no answers, only another question. They'll fill 2 wash basins with the same bucket of water. One sat beside the stove. The other rested beneath the boy's bed. By sunrise, a thin skin of ice covered the first basin. The second had frozen more than halfway through. She tied a loose strand of wool across a narrow crack between 2 floorboards. When the northwest wind returned, the strand leaned inward. Corbin held an oil lamp while Dell pried up a small plank near the bed. She lowered a candle into the dark space beneath the cabin. The flames stretched toward the southeast instead of standing straight. It was moving. She crawled outside and circled the cabin on her hands and knees. The northwest wall faced directly into a narrow cut between two ridges. The stone piers created a bottleneck beneath the floor. Wind entered wide, squeezed through the opening, and rushed faster beneath the cabin. They did not know the science behind it. She only knew the wind was cooling the underside of the floor faster than the stove could warm the top. That night, she marked 2 spots on the floor with charcoal. Every hour, she pressed her hand against each mark. Nothing changed. Milo watched her quietly before asking, "Does the wind live under the house?" They looked into the darkness beneath the loose plank. "No," she said softly. "It only passes through. I'm going to make it leave our warmth behind." The following night was even colder. They sat beside the stove after both boys had fallen asleep. Above the mantel hung Everett's old framing chisel. It had not been touched since spring. She remembered helping him dig root cellars for a farm south of the valley. Even during the hottest weeks of summer, those pits stayed cool. During winter, the earth beneath them never froze as deeply as the ground above. Everett had once said that salt changed its temperature slowly. It changed its mind every hour. They carried an iron probing bar outside and tested 3 places around the cabin. The surface was frozen hard. Near the eastern wall, the ground below felt drier. It also stood beyond the path where melting snow usually flowed each spring. An idea settled quietly into place. Perhaps the answer was not sealing every crack beneath the floor. Perhaps the answer was sleeping below the wind itself, not in a storage pit, a room, one that stayed dry, breathed fresh air, and never touched the stone piers holding the cabin above. She unrolled Everett's old measuring line and stretched it across the eastern half of the floor. Corbin woke and found her marking charcoal lines across the boards. "Should we ask Inakaro?" he whispered. They kept measuring. "Not yet." She tied off the line exactly where Everett used to stand while repairing loose floorboards. For a moment, her eyes rested on her son's hands. Then she made the next mark. Before the dawn broke over Rupine Hollow, Dell lifted the first floorboard. They did not begin by digging a large hole. She knelt on the floor with a piece of charcoal and drew a rectangle beneath the eastern half of the cabin. 9 pies 2 pulgadas long, 6 pies 8 pulgadas wide. The floor would rest about 5 pies 4 pulgadas below the ground outside. The ceiling would rise only 4 pies 7 pulgadas at its highest point. No one would stand inside. They would only sit, sleep, and wait out the cold. She measured again before adding another mark. The room stayed well clear of the main stone piers, especially those supporting the stove and chimney. She would not trade warmth for a collapsed cabin. 2 low sleeping platforms would run along opposite walls. A narrow walkway would separate them. A shallow niche would hold a single oil lamp. The hatch would hide beneath the blanket chest instead of the middle of the floor, keeping the entrance away from the front door and its drafts. They'll plan to line the lower walls with flat sandstone from the cut near Crawler's Creek. Temporary braces would come from young quaking aspen. Ralph's lodgepole would span the ceiling. A low intake pipe would face southeast. A taller exhaust would rise near the stove but never connect to the chimney. Corbin held Everett's measuring line steady. "Why not make it bigger?" he asked. They adjusted one end by 6 pulgadas. The earth only needs to keep 3 people alive. She said, "It doesn't have to hold the whole house." For a moment, Corbin looked toward the empty space beside the lines. "We could build one more bunk." He stopped before finishing. Dell simply nodded toward the measuring line. "Hold it there." Dell opened the first section, one careful cut at a time. The frozen surface fought every shovel stroke. Each bite of earth came up thin and hard. A foot lower, the soil became drier, darker, and easier to shape. She filled old flour sacks with dirt. Corbin dragged every sack into the yard, but Dell never allowed him inside the excavation. Instead, he spread the soil over the potato beds, filled washed-out drainage ruts, and packed it around the chicken pen before the next freeze. Milo sat beside the open hatch with a small lantern, counting each sack until the numbers tangled together. Every few minutes he coughed and wandered back toward the stove to warm himself. 3 days passed. The excavation grew deeper. The wood pile did not. Large logs still waited beside the chopping block while the weather grew colder with each sunset. Del dismantled part of the old livestock fence to cut temporary braces from its timbers. The chickens were crowded into a smaller shelter. Then she wrapped Everett's last brass collar clip in cloth and carried it to Bram Talons's general store. Bram turned the worn piece of brass over in his hand before placing it on the scale. "What are you building?" he asked. "I need an air passage that mice can't use," Del replied. He studied her a moment longer before trading a short length of stovepipe and a roll of wire screen. When Del returned home, the bright outline where Everett's brass clip had hung remained on the wall. Milo noticed the empty spot. Where did Father's clip go? Del handed him the wire screen instead. "Keep this from bending," she said. A week passed before Del made her first serious mistake. She widened the northern side too quickly. One more section, she thought. One more cut before setting another brace. The earth answered first. A dry slab broke free without warning. It slammed into the floor of the excavation, smothered the lantern, snapped the handle of her small shovel, and drove a heavy mass of soil against Del's left leg. She was pinned before she could move. The sound brought Corbin running. It reached the edge of the opening. "I'm coming down." "No." Her voice was sharp enough to stop him. "Throw me the rope." Corbin looped the rope over a ceiling beam and pulled until his hands burned. Del clawed the loose dirt away from her trapped leg one handful at a time. It took nearly 20 minutes before she could free herself. She climbed out limping. Instead of examining her bruised leg, she went straight to the cabin floor. Near the boy's bed, a thin crack had appeared between two floorboards. Corbin looked from the crack to the open excavation. "We should get Enoch." Del did not argue, but first she grabbed the shovel. Everything she had opened beyond the last brace came back out. She filled part of the excavation again, shortened the exposed section, drove fresh quaking aspen braces into place, and refused to open another span until the previous one stood secure. With a piece of charcoal, she marked both ends of the crack across the floorboards. The mark became her ruler. She checked it every morning. She checked it every evening. 2 days passed. The crack never grew another fraction of an inch. Only then did Del continue digging. She learned something the mountain had no interest in teaching gently. Determination could move a shovel. It could not hold back earth. From that day forward, every new section was fully braced before another inch of ground was opened. Corbin never forgot the sound of collapsing saw. Nor did he forget standing above the hatch with the rope cutting into his hands, wanting to climb down and obeying anyway. When Del finally reached the floor, he quietly turned away before she could see the tears running down his face. Del's limp did not escape notice. Agnes Weller, a widowed neighbor whose cabin stood 200 yards down the hollow, saw it while carrying feed past the cabin and returned the next morning with Enoch Harrow, the aging carpenter who inspected foundations throughout Rapine Hollow. Enoch never asked permission before stepping beneath the lifted floorboards. He measured the distance from the excavation to every main stone pier. He studied the braces. He climbed into the unfinished chamber without a word. When he finally spoke, there was no mockery in his voice. The walls could fail during spring thaw. He touched the sandstone Del had stacked nearby. A stone against cold earth will collect moisture. He looked toward the opening plan for the hatch. 3 people can use the air faster than you think. His finger followed the charcoal line marking the intake. If the wind reaches this pipe, it'll blow cold air back inside. Then he glanced toward the stove, and changing pressure can pull smoke down from the cabin. Del showed him the layout of both air passages and the clearance around the main supports. Enoch nodded once. "You stayed away from the foundation." A pause followed. That was the right decision. Then he added quietly, "It won't be enough." Outside, Harlan Creed, a prosperous rancher who rarely missed a chance to dismiss other people's ideas, had been listening from the yard. "They'd be better off staying with neighbors," he called. "Better that than burying 2 boys under a cabin." Del never looked up. She dragged another sack of dirt across the yard, favoring her injured leg. Corbin took 1 step toward Heron. Del glanced at him only once. That was enough. He turned around, walked back inside, opened the firewood notebook, and wrote down the day's count. Before leaving, Enoch stopped beside the northern wall. Without saying a word, he straightened one of the aspen braces by less than an inch. They'll finish the basic excavation before the first heavy snow arrived. She laid flat sandstone along the lower walls, wedging smaller stones into the gaps and sealing the larger openings with clay mixed with wood ash. 2 low sleeping platforms rose on either side of the narrow passage. Being the eastern wall, she left a smaller gap filled with dry bunchgrass, shredded cottonwood bark, and coarse wool too rough for spinning. She had too little insulation to do the same on the northern side. There the stone rested much closer to the earth. A low intake pipe opened toward the southeast. A taller exhaust rose near the stove. 2 small wooden slides allowed both passages to be adjusted. The first test began with a single candle. Near the floor, the flame leaned gently toward the intake. Near the ceiling, it drifted toward the exhaust. The room was breathing. That night, Dell let the boys sleep below for the first time. Milo did not cough for hours. The tin cup beside his bed stayed free of ice. Corbin marked another charcoal line in the notebook. The lower room held a steadier warmth than the cabin above. They woke before dawn because something felt wrong. The room was silent. For one frightening moment, she thought Milo had stopped breathing. She knelt beside him until she felt warm, steady breaths against her hand. Only then did she notice the first bead of water sliding down the northern sandstone wall. The room was warmer. The stone was sweating. If the walls stayed wet, the blankets would follow. Damp bedding would steal heat. Mold would come next. Enoch's warning had reached the room before he had. Dale had not solved the problem. She had only uncovered the next one. Dell didn't reach for another blanket, nor did she feed more wood into the stove. Instead, she immediately pulled the bedding away from the northern wall and ran her fingertips across the damp sandstone blocks. That was exactly where she had set the stone closest to the earth to save on insulation. Now she understood. Warm air from 3 sleeping bodies and a single oil lamp met the coldest surface in the room. The moisture had nowhere else to go. Corbin looked at the wall they had spent days building. Couldn't we just wipe it dry every morning? Dale shook her head. A wet blanket steals warmth faster than cold stone. She began lifting the stones back out. Nearly an entire day disappeared as the northern wall came apart. She widened the gap behind it, packed in the last of the cottonwood bark, the remaining bunchgrass, and every scrap of coarse wool she still had. She also widened the upper exhaust by another inch to carry more damp air away. Enoch stopped by that afternoon. He saw the dismantled wall, but offered no criticism. Which side got wet? Dale pointed north. He nodded once. A stone dozen la. 3 nights followed. The damp patch grew smaller after the first, smaller again after the second. On the 3rd morning, the sandstone stayed dry. Corbin picked up the last stone from the old wall. Dell's muddy fingerprints still marked one edge. He brushed it clean with his sleeve and set it into the new wall without another word. A hard west wind arrived before the worst of winter. Dale climbed into the room to make another inspection and stopped beside the intake pipe. The wall strand no longer leaned inward. It pointed the wrong way. Cold air rushed through the pipe, skimmed across the floor, and made the lower candle dance violently. Milo tucked both hands inside his sleeves without a word. Corbin looked toward the hatch. Dale slid the intake shutter partly closed, but refused to seal it. Stale air could become as dangerous as cold air. She pulled on her coat and crawled outside into the wind. Enoch had been right. The intake faced southeast, but the cabin wall on the low bank beside it bent the strong west wind around the corner and drove it straight into the pipe. Dell gathered flat sandstone and woven willow branches. She built a low windbreak a short distance from the intake, leaving a sheltered pocket behind it. Then she added a short L-shaped elbow to the pipe, so incoming air had to change direction before entering the room. Corbin held the lantern while she adjusted the stones a few inches at a time. They tested it again. At first, the wall strand hung still. They shifted the windbreak slightly farther west. The strand leaned inward, only slightly. That was enough. Fresh air entered slowly instead of pouring across the floor as a freezing draft. Milo picked up his father's wooden whistle from the sleeping platform. His hands had been hidden inside his sleeves until then. He turned the whistle over once before slipping it quietly into his pocket. He still never blew it. Enoch returned the next morning. He watched the wall strand for nearly a minute before speaking. It works today. He looked toward Corbin. Start riding down the wind. Corbin frowned. A room that works with a south wind may fail in a west wind. Eno said the weather changes before people do. Corbin opened the notebook and added another page. By the last week of December, Dell trusted the room enough to spend another night below. A small fire burned upstairs to keep the chimney warm and prevent ice from forming inside the flue. Near midnight, one log collapsed into glowing coals. Dell opened the stove door to feed another stick of wood. A thin ribbon of smoke drifted across the cabin. At almost the same moment, the pressure between the warm cabin and the cooler room below changed. Corbin smelled the smoke first. Dell opened the hatch immediately and hurried both boys upstairs. No one struggled to breathe, but the blankets below carried the unmistakable smell of wood smoke. The room had kept its warmth. It had failed another test. The hatch sealed against cold air. It did not seal against changing pressure. Dell removed the hatch frame, added a stepped wooden overlap, packed the edges with clay mixed with ash, and pressed a strip of tightly felted sheep's wool around the opening to form a gasket. She also changed the way she tended the stove. Instead of letting the fire burn low before adding fresh wood, she kept a steady bed of glowing coals throughout the night. When the repairs were finished, Corbin carried a candle around every edge of the hatch. The flame never leaned toward a crack. From that night forward, a small candle always burned beside the hatch whenever the family slept below. If its flame bent strangely or if it went out, everyone climbed upstairs immediately. That evening, Dell wrapped Milo inside a blanket while checking him for the smell of smoke. He looked toward the room below. Can we sleep there again tomorrow? Dell nodded once. We will, but only if the candle agrees. The first week of January became Dell's proving ground. There was no blizzard yet. Nighttime temperature still dropped below zero, giving her just enough cold to test the room without risking her family. Corbin devoted several pages of the notebook to something new. Not stories, measurements. Each morning, he recorded the number of firewood sticks burned during the night. He checked the thin sheet of ice inside the tin cup. He marked where frost reached across the cabin floorboards. He compared the warmth above with the warmth below. He ran his fingers across the northern sandstone wall to make sure it stayed dry. Finally, he counted how many times Milo coughed before falling asleep. 3 nights, 3 pages. The pattern never changed. The cabin above remained coldest along the floor. The room below stayed between 45 and 48 grados. The tin cup never froze. The northern wall stayed dry. The wood pile shrank more slowly than before. Milo coughed only a few times before sleeping through the rest of the night. At Bram Tolan's store, Corbin mentioned they were using less firewood. Bram smiled politely. A 12-year-old can count wrong. Corbin quietly opened the notebook. One page, then another. Every mark matched the next. Bram stopped talking. Later, Enoch studied the same pages. 3 cold nights aren't the same as 1 hard blizzard, he said. Then for the first time, he asked Dell a question instead of giving one. How much higher is your exhaust than your intake? Dell answered without looking up from her work. Enoch nodded thoughtfully. Far beyond the rooftops of Rupine Hollow, a long band of leaded clouds settled across the northwestern peaks. Dell closed the notebook. 3 nights don't make a winter, she told Corbin. Outside, the wind changed direction. The storm arrived on January 14th. Snow drifted down gently that morning. By afternoon, the northwest wind drove it sideways across Rupine Hollow. Before the sun set, every trail disappeared. The second day brought 18 below. The third brought stronger wind. Snow buried fences stacked against barns and buried wood piles beneath hard white drifts. On the 4th night, Bram's thermometer fell to 32 below. The valley began to fail one cabin at a time. The roof above one woodshed tore loose. Agnes Weller's storehouse door froze shut. Snow blocked part of Harlan Creed's chimney until smoke rolled back into his cabin. One family burned broken chairs because their dry firewood lay trapped beneath frozen drifts. Del changed nothing. She cooked upstairs during daylight. Every evening, the family moved below. On the sixth day, the wind struck directly toward the intake. The wall strand still leaned inward. The stone windbreak and elbow pad held. The northern wall stayed dry. Then Corbin noticed something else. The warning candle burned shorter than usual. They looked up. Snow was choking the upper exhaust. She tied a rope around her waist. "Hold tight," she said. She disappeared into the storm. The rope sagged. Then it snapped tight as the wind caught her. Corbin wrapped the line around his forearm and leaned backward with all his weight. "Mama." Milo cried. Corbin never moved. Outside, Del crawled through waist-deep snow, found the buried vent, and drove the shovel handle through the packed drift until the opening cleared. When she returned below, the candle stood taller almost immediately. That night, the air outside reached -40 grados. The cabin floor, far from the stove, nearly froze solid. The room beneath remained close to 44 grados. The storm found every weakness it could reach. The damp wall was gone. The reverse draft was gone. The leaking hatch was gone. Nature had tested every correction Del had made. These time, none of them failed. In the dead of that night, as the temperature outside plummeted to -40, there came a knock at the door. Not loudly, just 3 weak blows. Del opened it and found Harlan Creed standing in the blowing snow. Frost covered his beard and shoulders. In his arms was 7-year-old Tomas. The boy shook so violently his boots rattled against his father's leg. His lips had lost their color. He could barely stay on his feet. Smoke had been backing into Harlan's cabin for hours. He did not defend himself. He did not repeat a single word he had once used against Del. He asked only one question. "Is there room?" They looked toward the hatch. The room below had been built for 3 people. 4 would be crowded. 5 would mean more moisture, less fresh air, and less room for mistakes. She looked at Milo, sitting quietly on the warmest platform against the eastern wall. Then she nodded. "Tomas comes down." Arlon started to follow. Del stopped him. "You stay up here." He looked confused. "Keep the stove burning low. Watch the chimney. If snow covers the exhaust, clear it. If the warning candle changes, call me," he answered immediately. "I will." Below, Corbin slid the storage box against the wall to make another sleeping space. Without anyone asking, Malo pulled his own blanket away from the warm corner and spread it across to us. The room felt different almost at once. Warmer, damp. Del opened the upper exhaust another notch. She watched the wall strand. It still leaned gently inward. She watched the warning candle. Its flame remained steady. The room was still breathing. Nearly an hour passed before Tomas stopped shivering. His breathing slowed. His hands relaxed beneath Malo's blanket. Used before dawn, he finally fell asleep. Aaron climbed down to check on his son. The ceiling forced him to bow his head. He removed his hat without thinking. His hand rested against the northern sandstone wall. Dry, not cold, dry. He left without speaking. Behind him, Malo shifted in his sleep. The blanket no longer covered his own shoulders. Del reached to pull it back. Half asleep, Malo caught the edge before she could. He tugged it over Tomas once more. Then he rolled quietly toward the wall. The blizzard refused to leave. It stayed another 3 days. Twice each day, Del climbed into the cabin above to stir cornmeal porridge, tend the stove, and knock snow from the roof before the weight became dangerous. Later on the 8th day, another problem appeared. While Del was upstairs cooking, the bitter cold swelled and tightened the hatch frame until the wood locked itself shut. When she tried to head back down and realized the hatch wouldn't open, Del grabbed Everett's old framing chisel and carefully worked the blade beneath the edge from above. Below, Corbin heard wood scraping against wood. He had no idea what was happening. He lit the lantern, sat beside the hatch, and gripped the spare chisel across his knees. I never woke Malo. I never woke yes. When the hatch finally lifted, Dell climbed down with hands trembling from the cold. Without a word, Corbin handed her the larger piece of cornbread he had saved. She understood why he had been waiting. That night, Malo never coughed. The silence woke Dell. For one terrible heartbeat, she thought silence meant loss. She leaned close and placed her hand beneath Malo's nose. Warm breath touched her fingers, slow, steady. Outside, the wind still struck the cabin with all its strength. Inside, the room settled near 43 degrees and held there. Morning arrived quietly. The wool strand beside the intake barely moved. The storm had finally run out of questions. Nature never announced a winner. It simply stopped testing them. The storm left as quietly as it had arrived. One cabin at a time, Rupine Hollow dug itself back out of the snow. Agnes Weller was among the first to reach Dell's door. She carried a kettle of broth, expecting to find an exhausted family barely holding together. Instead, Malo sat cross-legged on the eastern sleeping platform, patiently tying a fresh cord onto his father's wooden whistle. Corbin was outside counting the remaining firewood. Agnes looked from the woodpile to her own cracked hands. Her family had burned almost everything they owned. They had even pulled 2 rails from the pasture fence for fuel. Bram Tolan arrived later with the thermometer from his store. He checked the lower room. He examined the tin cup. Then he asked for Corbin's notebook. Page after page showed the same pattern. Less than half the firewood, no frozen cup, a dry northern wall, steady temperatures. Bram closed the notebook without argument. Enoch came last. He inspected the clearance around the stone piers. He found the charcoal marks beside the old floor crack. He checked the insulation gap behind the sandstone. He followed the intake pipe outside and studied the hatch frame inside. Finally, he pressed his bare hand against the northern wall. Dry. He looked at his palm before removing his hat. You left how much space behind these stones? Used under 2 pulgadas, Dell answered. And the elbow on the intake it slows the wind before it reaches the room. Enoch gave a slow nod. He asked nothing else. At the doorway, Harlan stood with Tomas beside him. He never interrupted. When they left, he placed a bundle of dry firewood against the porch. No apology followed. None was needed. Dell poured half of Agnes's broth back into the kettle. Take this home, she said. Your children need it more than mine. Agnes lowered her eyes before accepting it. The weeks after the blizzard sounded different, not because the wind had changed, because the valley had. Enoch never copied Dell's room exactly. He copied the principles instead. Agnes' cabin stood on shallow footings, so he designed a half-buried shelter against the northern wall with a drainage trench and a sloped timber roof. Behind Bram's store, a small underground room protected flour, beans, and lamp oil from freezing. In return for showing him how Dell had arranged the intake and exhaust, Bram quietly erased part of her debt. Another family connected a low sleeping space to an old root cellar. Arlon rebuilt the ground around his chimney and moved his firewood into a sheltered corner where drifting snow could not bury it again. He never called Dell's room foolish another time. One Sunday, Reverend Alden Pike stood before the congregation. He did not call the family's survival a miracle. He said a prayer could never replace closing a gap that people had already found, measured, and understood. By the end of winter, shovels rang beneath or beside 7 different cabins. People began calling them low rooms. No two looked alike. Each depended on different soil, different water, different foundations, and different timber. Yet everyone followed the same lessons. Stay out of the wind. Let the earth change temperature slowly. Keep stone dry. Move fresh air gently. Measure first. Believe afterward. One afternoon, Corbin stood outside the cabin and listened. Shovels echoed across the valley from every direction. He opened the old firewood notebook one last time. He looked at the first page. Then he quietly closed it. Years passed, but the room beneath Dell's cabin remained. It was never hidden again. The blanket chest still rested above the hatch, just as it always had. But everyone in the family knew what waited below. Not a cellar, not a secret, a place where the house had learned how to live with winter instead of arguing against it. Corbin grew into a surveyor for wagon roads pushing farther west. Before marking the site for a way station or a small cabin, he always studied the wind first, then the drainage, then the temperature of the ground beneath his boots. Only after that did he reach for his stakes. Milo became known for repairing stoves and chimneys throughout the valley. Whenever a family complained that their cabin would not stay warm, he never told them to burn more wood. He knelt beside the floorboards first. He searched for hidden drafts, empty spaces beneath the cabin and the path the air was taking before touching the stove. Years later, Malo hung his father's wooden whistle right beside the hatch. He still never blew it. But now the silence surrounding it no longer meant loss. It meant safety. It meant home. They'll never call the room an invention. Neither did Enoch. People had dug earth shelters, root cellars, and covered sleeping pits long before anyone settled Rapine Hollow. They had simply remembered an old truth: on the one freezing night her family could no longer afford another wrong answer. During the -40-degree blizzard, they had not created summer beneath the ground. They lived between 43 and 48 grados. They ate cold cornbread. They slept beneath a low ceiling. They burned far less firewood than their neighbors. That was never comfort. It was the narrow distance between exhaustion and survival. They never defeated winter. They simply stopped letting the wind decide how much warmth their family was allowed to.